Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his harp on the stage and then is heard no more.
Well, this was inevitable. When you talk about Silent Hill with the passion and fervor that I do, one day you have to put aside sucking the dick of an over 20-year-old franchise and bust out the old complaining cudgel to talk about the shitty ones. Despite what it seems, I actually don't like being negative on this channel.
Falls so fucking flat and leaves no impact. It's shit like this. Every level just has some pace demolishing section in it that makes replaying it a chore. Even though I hold a profound love for these kinds of games, the gameplay was getting to be a bit too much even for me. Fuck you, Kitty Kong. There is no greater meaning to this video. I made the whole thing just to say fuck you, Kitty Kong. I'm not even gonna do the outro. Fuck it, I'm gone. Chapter 7. Death. Smash never learns.
I didn't say it was always positive, but I don't revel in negativity. This goes double for games I don't like. See, with a bad movie, the amount of input on my end is incredibly minimal. I just slap on Anastasia and fight the urge to fall asleep or retweet porn. But when I have to play through a bad game, I don't get the luxury of ruining someone's timeline at 8 AM because I'm too busy making moony eyes at the nearest 4th-story window. Point is, a bad game is something born to be interacted with, and much like the Thalidomide babies, this thing was ruined long before it ever drew breath, and to that I feel an immense amount of pity. Today's topic is Silent Hill Downpour, the last entry into the Silent Hill canon. You have 4 seconds to get the fuck out of my video before I call the authorities. So, a bit of context. We're coming up on the 10th anniversary of Downpour's release, and just saying this made me lose some cartilage in my knee. The only thing I can compare it to is what I imagine a dementia patient feels when you tell them their wife has been dead for over a decade. It's just this longing sadness followed by the immediate evacuation of my bowels. Within the greater perspective of the Silent Hill community, Downpour is looked on favorably? I think that's charitable enough. Of the Western games, most people have come to a shaky agreement that Downpour is the least bad of them, which is astounding because this game is fucking horrendous. I played this when I was 13 as it was one of the first Silent Hill games I owned, and I can only remember it being boring and not impactful. Upon my most recent playthrough, I had an incredibly negative reaction to almost everything this game did. In this video, I want to first figure out why this game was received relatively warmly by the public, and then dedicate the rest of it to shitting on this train wreck with the force of 1,000 dementia patients. So with that tortured simile hopefully reaching its end, let's dive into Silent Hill Downpour as I read the series its last rites, and may God have mercy on us all.
Let me out, 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 no more. I'm through. You win. I am dead. You're sorry, sorry, no, you're alive. It's over, nothing here left alive. Let me out, 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 let me out.
Okay, so let's do a quick inventory check for 2012 and what the landscape of horror games was looking like at the time. Oh god, what the fuck? Ew. Okay, what about the year before?
運命の人よどうかまっすぐに
How is it almost as bad? Okay, If you aren't picking up what I'm putting down, horror games were in a bad way in the 7th gen. For the sake of comparison, the next year we saw the release of Aliens Colonial Marines, and if that doesn't show the sheer barrel scraping that was happening at the time, I don't know what will. It's called coping. People so desperately wanted this to be the game that brought back survival horror for the thinking man, and do it in a big way. People were willing to overlook things like the story being shit, the designs being lame, the chase segments being a waste of time, the characters being obnoxious,
One eternity later.
the game running like shit, and Murphy's kid being the ugliest motherfucker ever. Where's I going with this? Oh, yeah, they just wanted to try and embrace this game and ring in a new era of survival horror. But I am not a starved survival horror fan circa 10 years ago. I am a bitter internet personality who has a lumberjack union's worth of metaphorically contextual axes to grind. With hindsight being 2020 and all, it makes forgiving Downpour much more difficult as everything within it reeks of doing without knowing. A small anecdote for the sake of comparison. When I was in my late teens, some 5 or 6 years ago, I recorded a podcast with my friends that is now completely lost to time, God willing. In this podcast, we had one friend record our Discord call in OBS. Simple, I have no money or experience type shit. Thing is, we all knew that when people recorded stuff, they did a clap sync. So we did a little countdown and did the clap sync, simple as that. But it didn't matter because there's only one master recording, not 5 different people recording their audio. So the clap was completely superfluous and unnecessary. This is what Western Silent Hill games remind me of. I knew deep down that people who record stuff like this do clap syncs, but I didn't get why and just did it without thinking critically. Downpour is clearly a victim of its own preceding legacy. Almost every piece of this game's DNA can be traced back to Silent Hill 1 through 4, which in a sense makes it hard to discuss because most criticisms can just loop back to this was done better in X, and that's fucking boring. I may as well just sit here CinemaSin style and hit a ding every time I roll my eyes. Conversely, this game also breaks my general style for discussing Silent Hill because there frankly isn't much to discuss. Downpour in my memory appears as a cold gray sludge with some hint of fiery red, specifically in those moments where I wished bad things on devs of certain boss fights. I'm somewhat at a loss for where to go with this script, so I'll try and start at the beginning and go into things as they come up. Our game starts with the introduction of Murphy Pendleton, which I just gotta stop us right there. Fucking Murphy Pendleton. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and lie to you and say all Silent Hill characters don't line up somewhat adjacently on the what the fuck is this name scale, but most of them have a nice ring to them, like Harry Mason, James Sunderland, hell, even Alex Shepard flows better. Saying Murphy Pendleton sounds like I'm trying to eject a sink out of my esophagus. He sounds like a really racist Irish character out of Faulty Towers. So for the rest of this video, I refuse to call him Murphy Pendleton and will instead substitute with more appropriate names. You'll know when you hear him. So we're introduced to Seamus O'Shaughnessy as he's escorted through a prison in which he is serving a sentence for what I can only assume are IRA-related offenses. Darby O'Gill is led to the showers where he follows through on a deal with Correctional Officer Sewell to set up a scenario where he can kill a fellow prisoner named Napier and more or less get off scot-free. This shower shanking serves as a tutorial for combat, which should be a red flag big enough to launch a Soviet revolution. Silent Hill isn't a franchise known for combat in the same way penguins aren't known for flying. Like in most cases, it's optimal to avoid the activity altogether, but you can still throw that penguin out of a jet and call it flying. In the same way, you can work combat in a Silent Hill, but you can't expect that bird to fly, let alone live. In the first 4 titles, combat is a means to an end. It just happens and it's unavoidable. Most enemies are pretty easy to beat, taking only a few hits from a melee weapon or at most 6 bullets from your pistol. But for some ungodly reason, combat is a fucking event in Downpour. They really want you to get into the system, but the issue with that is that it's completely impossible. As much as it loads me to say it, Homecoming's combat is vastly superior to this, which if you know me, that's a shocking statement because I don't like saying anything nice about Homecoming. The one advantage Homecoming has is its dodge mechanic. Is it stupid? Yes. Is it out of place? Definitely. But if you're gonna make me do combat in a Silent Hill game, at least make the combat somewhat functional. In Downpour, we basically get the worst of Origins and Homecoming combined. It's clunky and abuses weapon degradation like the former, and is ever present like the latter. The way that 13th Taisha Edna Kenny moves is far more stagnated than his predecessors, despite being the most modern title in the series. Like I said, in Silent Hill 1 through 4, combat was a fact of life, but not the center of your universe. And yet the combat still feels infinitely better because the camera isn't wildly swinging about as you try to make an OTP out of a sex monster and a rusty pipe. Downpour makes combat a seemingly main focus of the formula, but it's honestly so much easier to just ignore it. If I had $1 for every time I was able to just run from a jump scare encounter, I would have approximately $27, but this game's kind of short, so that's a staggering amount given the variables at work here. The combat issue is a microcosm of the inherent movement issues this game has in general. If the classics controlled like tanks, then this controls like a dying RC car. Movement is incredibly slow, clunky, and just plain awkward to engage with, so in a sense, it perfectly reflects the Downpour experience. I've noticed this in passing, and I think I'm gaslighting myself with it because I cannot do it intentionally, but I can almost say for certain that Colin from the Simpsons movie's hitbox is slightly larger than you would anticipate. I find myself getting stuck on corners of objects and walls and have to wiggle loose here and there, which sounds minor but becomes incredibly grating as it keeps occurring. Now that my 2-minute and 23-second symposium about jank movement controls is over, let's continue with the story. So, Father Ted murders Philip Seymour Hoffman in the shower and is transferred to a new prison, some fuckery happens, and the bus crashes, and you end up in Silent Hill. You know, that effect didn't happen in the other videos. I feel like something's wrong. From here, you get a grasp of the awful movement and meet your first character in Anne Cunningham. Cunningham is easily the worst Silent Hill character. Like, she just fucking sucks. I have no meaningful analysis or deep commentary to offer. She's just so ungodly obnoxious and actively drags the entire game down with every second she's on screen. Here, I can just summarize all of her scenes. Get on the ground, shitbag. Get on the ground. I am now sad. Get on the ground, dirtbag. I'm a scared little girl. Please, I'm so sad. My daddy's dead. It's my birthday. You were a little guy on her birthday, would you? Okay, free to go. Did that sound lifeless, half-assed, and completely unnecessary? Congratulations, you have just discovered why I don't like Anne Cunningham. Now, this is a reductive summary for sure, but that's like reducing 0.005 by 0.0004. It's so minimal because what's there is already immensely lacking. Her character is something that only makes some sense after you finish the game. But unlike the cast of, say, 2, you aren't left with a compulsion to go back and see how your perspective changes on a replay, because why would you ever want to replay Downpour? Cunningham is the worst of it, but this game has a major issue with all of its characters. Mostly in the sense that they are all void of any form of human interaction and personality. Forgive my constant comparison, but look at 1 and 3. All of the cast members have some form of a rapport with the protagonist that helps define their main character's struggle and supports their arc. They feel full of life and do a great job of sticking in your brain. Even in 2, where every character is intentionally written to be off-putting and inhuman, they have some heart to them that makes their strangeness stand out and make more sense by the end of the game. If I wanted to do what I normally do for these videos, I'd end up spending at most 3 minutes discussing this game's whole cast because they're so uniformly forgettable. The only reason I can remember any of their names is because I'm an obsessive who's currently cross-referencing the wiki as I write this. JP Sater is a nothing character who exists for 2 seconds and dies. Napier, as an antagonist, is one-dimensional and is the most unsympathetic part of this game. And the only character I tolerate is Sewell because he's an actual bastard man, and at least that's somewhat fun. Do not even get me started, though, on Howard Blackwood. If Cunningham is the worst Silent Hill character, Howard might be the most useless. He functionally serves no purpose. He solely exists to guilt trip Bono. Basically, at any moment the Edge has a naughty thought, Blackwood decides to roll up on the scene and give us another helping of Murphy's Mail Time like this. It's just another cheap tactic the game uses to give more depth to its story. And it's definitely an attempt, I'll give it that, in the same way you can give a shot glass more depth by drilling a hole in it. The glass may be broken, but hey, it's definitely deeper than it was. Downpour just gives you a character, gives them their one bit, and expects you to put the emotional labor into caring about them. If I have to meet your characters all the way, I'm only going to get halfway there and give up because frankly there isn't much to work towards. I've bitched and moaned enough, but I gotta discuss the bland Irishman in the room. James Joy, I'm done with that bit. Murphy Pendleton is so ungodly boring in every sense of the word, and this mostly comes down to his motivating theme throughout the game. The story focuses very heavily on the nature of revenge. The way the plot handles this theme is the same way I assume a bull handles its first shift at a china shop. Revenge is a really good basis to work off of in regards to telling a story about the human condition, as it's a solid moral quandary that has a lot of room for exploration. Good stories about revenge will always ask what motivates someone to commit to revenge, and what they intend to get out of it. In most cases, the moral of the story is that revenge is almost never worth it, and the action of pursuing it will only lead to further retaliation. The famous saying goes, if you seek revenge, you should dig 2 graves. There isn't anything necessarily wrong with this conclusion either. You can disagree, but the argument, if made well, can be effective and logical. A great example of this is found in Nier, specifically the sections in the junkyard, where the game presents a motivating factor, a natural endpoint, and an understandable complication that shows the futility of it all. Downpour lacks more or less all of this. This is because when the type of story is done poorly, it just wants you to accept that the act of revenge in itself is a moral failing. When you do this, you once more put your audience in a position where they are forced to put the work in to emotionally connect with your story because the nature of the narrative is completely inhuman. This discussion requires me to go a little bit more in depth on the actual story. Well, what little of it there actually is. I'm going to be as blunt as a bullet train coming up, so if any of the following is potentially upsetting to you, please skip to this time code. In the simplest sense, the story of Silent Hill Downpour follows Murphy Pendleton, a convict and father who stabbed a man in prison. Throughout the entire game, we're left to wonder why he did this and what were the consequences beyond the initial sentencing. The reason, you ask? Because Patrick Napier molested and murdered Murphy's son, Charlie. Now, I try to say this with the utmost respect and reverence, but this is the worst possible thing this game could have to be the motivating factor. Because frankly, I don't think Murphy did anything wrong. There should be minimal guilt on his end. And don't worry, I'll address the other portion of this later, so hold that thought and indulge this perspective for a moment. If Napier did literally anything else, I could completely buy into the idea that Murphy went too far and should suffer some form of penance. I've been racking my brain about this for a while, and the best I could come up with is to have Napier kill Charlie by way of like a drunk driving accident or something. In this case, there could be some level of understanding where I don't have to have any sympathy for Napier, but they can show him being openly remorseful about what he did and spending the rest of his life in prison. Something that doesn't automatically give Murphy the moral high ground, because every time we see Napier, he's just an unrepentant scumbag who draws no sympathy from the audience, because he's honestly around for like maybe 5 minutes total. So with the variables we have at play, why does Murphy feel even the slightest amount of guilt when it comes to killing Napier? Like, is it on a moral scale the right thing to do? No. But do I begrudge Murphy or think less of him for it? Hell no. If the game fed more into this aspect of Murphy, I'd actually like him more, because believe it or not, killing pedophiles is actually pretty fucking cool. Instead, the game decides to hold its punches and leaves a minimal impact, retroactively making Murphy look like a fucking loser with no bite to him. This in tandem with the fact that we basically know nothing about Murphy throughout the entire game. This is because the game straight up puts no effort into building the world around Murphy's story. In my previous 2 Silent Hill videos, I put extreme emphasis on the levels you play through and how they correlate with the main theme and ideas the main character is struggling with. This is because it informs us what our characters are feeling without either A, telling us so, or B, outright ignoring it. Downpour does both at the same time somehow. Like, some levels are incredibly heavy-handed when it comes to what the message is supposed to be, and others I'm convinced were levels created for a proof of concept for this game, and they just forgot to make them interesting. An example of the former is the hybrid monastery orphanarium, where it is blatantly apparent that we have a theme of child abuse running through it, and it hits you with the nuance of a hockey check. Meanwhile, the latter is exemplified in the Centennial Building, which is probably the lamest Silent Hill area bar none. Like, the monastery and the mine are classically creepy locations, which are basically the 2010s equivalent of Boo Haunted House, but the Centennial Building isn't even that. This place is only scary if you're unnaturally afraid of bureaucracy and taxes, and the more I write this line, the more I'm convinced how truly horrifying this place is. It doesn't even end here, because we still have to talk about the other world. Forgive me as it has been a while, but I don't believe I've spoken much about the other world when it comes to Silent Hill. Odd considering it's like the series' gimmick, I suppose, but regardless, I love how 1, 3, and 4 handle this idea, more so in the first two. It's because it does really feel like a perversion of a familiar surrounding, which in turn serves to make the player even more uncomfortable. In Downpour, it's just too over the top, so to speak. Like, I wouldn't call the above listed examples necessarily subtle, but they didn't do shit like this. Looking at Downpour's Otherworld segments, you'd be forgiven for thinking that I'm playing a weird Batman Arkham Asylum spin-off featuring only the Scarecrow segments. I use that example jokingly, but I can vividly picture a rogue Downpour dev looking at that bit and going, write that down, write that down, write that down! Someone should be calling the gimmick infringement equivalent of Child Protective Services because they are absolutely abusing the fuck out of this thing. The key word is subtlety. Now, I feel somewhat dirty just saying it because subtlety has become such a buzzword regarding the Western Silent Hills. Subtlety in horror isn't a necessary component, but when it comes to Silent Hill, it's almost a requirement. This franchise has always felt like the thinking man's survival horror. While Resident Evil started out more action-centered, Silent Hill became something wholly different. I don't think a little bit of restraint would fix everything wrong here, but it might have been able to tighten things up a little bit better. Maybe if someone was holding back, we wouldn't get these fucking absurd chase segments. This was probably something unfortunate inherited from Shattered Memories, but in that game, it kind of makes some sense as combat is a non-focus there. Here I just run down hallways and try to escape from the... What's this thing called again? Oh god, it's actually just called the Void. Okay, well, I didn't learn that until 2 seconds ago, so I've just been calling it the Coof. Stuff like this is what makes Downpour extremely frustrating for me, because I can see what they were going for here. They wanted to make something to represent the crushing hole in Murphy's life that was created when he lost his son, while also doubling as a metaphor for the way that revenge has overtaken his life and is slowly picking him apart. Again, cool idea, but it doesn't work for me. Mostly because the game doesn't actually want to do anything with it except justify the look behind you button. These chase segments fucking suck, and the Coof is too on the nose of a metaphor to relate to. Something I genuinely appreciate about the good Silent Hills is that the emotion is universal. Like I put in my videos on 1 and 3, I may not be a father or a woman, but that doesn't alienate me from empathizing with Harry and Heather's stories. That's because those games had a clear focus point that they were built around, but they also left things intentionally vague in some scenarios where it's up to you to fill in the blanks. This rides an incredibly fine line because if done poorly, nothing makes sense and everything exists in this nothingness. Obviously, I think that those games execute their metaphors incredibly well, and Downpour just kind of flounders. I harp so much on the Coof because while I understand the idea of what it represents, I get the impression that the game doesn't. Instead of something within the text that informs us of how Murphy's feeling, it just reads as a big bad thingy that should be scary, but frankly just isn't. Oddly enough, this is one of the major complaints I heard from this game on release. It just isn't scary. Now, I don't believe that these games need to scare me to be good, but at least I get the sense that the others tried. And if I had to say, I don't think that people were down on this game because it didn't scare them. I think they were down on it because that's just Downpour's biggest failing, is that it doesn't make anyone feel anything, let alone scared. As I consistently have been drilling, everything about Downpour was more or less done better by its predecessors. This game is chock full of references to the golden age of the series, to the point where it is completely oversaturated and loses all effect. They use the "oh, it's you" bit from 2 fucking twice, which look, once made me cough up a lung, 2 times it's just insulting. It really just rides the line of if it's good, it's an homage, if it's bad, it's a cheap nostalgia pop. The way to do this right is in something like Final Fantasy XIV. Sure, it has cute references to the previous games here and there, but there's enough meat on this game's bones to give it its own identity. Downpour has no identity, and all of its references are skin deep. If they were going to learn from the older titles, they should have stolen the actually important stuff, which leads me to something that, if taking from older titles and doing nothing with it is the worst aspect of this game, this is the thing that pisses me off the most. Remember that thought I told you to hold on to a few paragraphs ago? Well, it's back and I wish it weren't. So the whole plot to kill Napier is the entire catalyst as to why this entire journey happens, right? Well, at the end of the game, we finally get a reveal as to what all occurred, and everything makes so much more sense. We finally learn that Cunningham's father was the nice guard Murphy was friends with, and that at some point he put in a formal complaint against Sewell for being so openly corrupt. We then learn, as per Murphy and Sewell's deal, Murphy is to kill said guard to hold up his end of the bargain for killing Napier. This actually completely wipes away my previous complaint I had with the story. I can fully understand why Murphy would feel guilty, and it actually serves as a subtle way of having the audience go through the same journey Murphy would have been on by having such a narrow tunnel vision in killing Napier. He was blind to the consequences something like this would have on others, and not just himself. It actually does a really great job of explaining how revenge is not this isolated act and can easily endanger innocent bystanders. Saving this kind of gut punch to fully absolve hitherto unlikable characters like Cunningham is actually super clever and really well executed, is what I would be saying if it were not for the good ending. Where to even start? Okay, I didn't want to bring out the big guns before I got into it, but I think it's necessary in this situation. The ending to Silent Hill 2 is perfect in every sense of the word. What makes it work so well is that no matter what ending you obtain, each one of them is a logical conclusion to the story, except for the joke endings, obviously. The crux of that finale hinges on the simple fact that no matter what, James always kills Mary. This is because each of the endings is just a different way that James copes with this fact. Regardless of what ending you decide is your favorite, the way you played James throughout his story is perfectly reflected, and you feel rewarded by the game with a logical end to the tale you just played. Downpour takes this and just fucking ruins it, just utterly and truly demolishes it. Because if you get the good ending of Downpour, which requires you to make 3 binary moral choice options, the entire inciting incident completely changes. In the good ending, it turns out that oopsie doodle, Murphy actually pussied out and didn't kill Napier, and he can't bring himself to kill Frank Coleridge, so Sewell just killed both of them and blamed Frank's death on Murphy. So we can just forgive Murphy outright because his hands are more or less clean. In being able to make sure our little cinnamon roll is pure, the game forgot one major aspect of this whole equation, in that this ending makes the entire game we just played fucking pointless. If you're going for the vibes of 2, which they so clearly are, you should know the main factor of that game is that it serves as James's atonement for what he did to Mary. The town is a prison of his own design, and he won't let himself out until he confronts what he did and chooses what to do next. The town in Downpour, by the time the good ending is done, is just like someone scolding their dog for pissing on the rug. I genuinely don't feel like Murphy learned a single thing from this whole experience, which is capped off by one of the most flaccid and outlandish boss fights the series has ever seen. The ending is just so nothing, it's actually hard to write about, because what is there to say about a finale so bad that it invalidates the preceding experience in such a significant way beyond saying just that? The game puts so much self-importance on its bullshit themes only to undercut all of them in one fell swoop. It tried to make itself seem so meaningful and deep, but it's just so fucking shallow and offensively bland that its story leaves you feeling nothing. This is something not pioneered by this game, but it's something that just kills any and all defense I could possibly have on this game. Even though I knew that this was coming, I still felt utterly deflated at the end of this playthrough. This is such a sticking point because it's like running a race and you're in dead last the whole time. And right when it looks like you can get maybe 3rd or 4th place, you just run off the track, spend 5 hours building a gallows, and then hang yourself in front of the empty stadium, except it's not empty. There's just one sour cunt in the audience, and that's me, motherfucker, and I got tomatoes and a good throwing arm. I just can't stop myself from comparing this game to the ones I adore because I laud them for a reason, and this game clearly gets it to some degree. I'd love to judge this game on its own merits, completely divorced from the rest of the franchise. I just wish the game would fucking let me. Which, for the 3 Downpour defenders out there, let me just say, if I reviewed this game as its own thing, it would have actually suffered more, because then I just called a boring piece of shit and I wouldn't have even made this video. Everything from the dog shit music, which, might I add, we couldn't even use for the intro because it's some of the most generic horror schlock I've ever heard, to such original sources of terror like the Boogeyman, who I should write more about, but I don't care. It's just because A to Z, everything in this game is a time-wasting mess. There could have been 1,000+ things I could say, but it all is just so unengaging. I feel like I'd be wasting your time even reviewing it. Do you really need me to say something about why having a full open world with optional checklist side quests in a Silent Hill game is a bad idea? Or how the boring puzzles that just mostly consist of using contextual axes left around conveniently to open up these special doors that only open to axes are boring and lame? Didn't think so. What I do want to end off on is actually a little bit about this game's development, because as much as I want to fucking loathe this game, I can't bring myself to hate it. Bet you didn't expect that one, but seriously, I just can't find it in my heart to completely say fuck this game and everyone who worked on it. Sure, I said some things in the heat of the moment, but upon reflection, it just isn't worth it. This game was supposed to be made by fans for fans. Those familiar with this era of the franchise are more or less acquainted with the name Tom Hewlett. Tom is known as the man who killed Silent Hill, and I want to be one of those people who steps up to bat for him because, you know what? He fucking tried. People gave Tom Hewlett so much shit throughout the entire lifespan of these games. Basically from Origins till he left Konami, and even after he was gone, people shat on this man for everything. And it sucks because this man clearly loved what he was doing. He was not down in the trenches making all the bad decisions. He was just the guy taking questions. If only one person in the world loved Silent Hill Downpour, it was Tom Hewlett. And you know what? That man did not deserve the shit he was and still sometimes is given for games like this. He was just the fan in the room who wanted to pay tribute to some of the most influential games he's ever played. I say this because I kind of relate with Tom. If I were put in his position, who's to say that my Silent Hill wouldn't turn out just as bad or even worse? It's really easy for me to play armchair dev and say fix this and this, but that's coming from a naive perspective of a 20-something who not even a year ago was just able to start buying alcohol. I look at Downpour as the little engine that couldn't. The lofty expectations hoisted upon it ended up crushing it, although without them it may have just been crushed under its own weight anyways. Downpour really is like a fan game, down to doing without knowing that games like Hunt Down the Freeman became infamous for. It had high aspirations that hurt it all the more when they crashed to the ground, since there was nothing in the story to support the legitimately heavy themes it was going for. Even still, I'm not confident the game would have met its own ambitions without softening all of the heaviest blows. The team at Vatra seemed to really want to make the Silent Hill for everyone, but what they created was rejected by fans and forgotten by the public. As for me, like I said, I remember this game better than most, but I still feel nothing towards it but pity. It is an unlovable mess that I so desperately wanted to hate with all of my heart for destroying my favorite franchise, but at the end of the day, I've come to terms with the fact that this game didn't kill Silent Hill. You can't kill something that's already been dead. No, instead of a smoking gun, Downpour is something much sadder. It's an extraneous straggler, a last expulsion of air from a bloated corpse, and much like the final verse sung from that cadaver's rotting lungs, it is filled with a longing regret and a desire to live again. In making this video, I've come to realize that I have accomplished nothing except waste my time, for Silent Hill Downpour is nothing more than a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. My name is Michael. Let's talk again soon. Hey, you already know what the deal is. Outro time. So, that game fucking sucks, and it really makes me sad every time I go back to it, but it's over, and we got the video out, so hopefully next year, when I do another one of the very, very not good Silent Hill games, it might be a little bit better than this one. I think it will be. But regardless, if you like the video, please like, comment, subscribe, follow me over at my Twitch and my Twitter. Everything is linked down in the bio below. And I just want to give a special thanks to everyone who helped me work on this video like I normally do. Thank you for watching. Bye.